So Doug Specht is researching how knowledge is constructed and codified through digital and cartographic artifacts, focusing on development issues in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. He speaks and writes on topics like data ethics, development, education, and mapping practices. Today, his talk, Opening Pandora's Box, Mapping and Open Data, will provide new perspectives that we're excited to hear. Thank you, Doug, for being here. And you still need to be put into the spotlight. Right now, we see Debian.
Oh. He needs to put in his camera.
So, Doug, can you... here, spotlight. Now we can see you. Great.
Wonderful.
Welcome. Can we hear you as well?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. Excellent. I was a little worried my microphone was playing up earlier, so I've been busy testing it for the last 5 minutes before we got here, so I'm glad it's working. And how nice to be in the spotlight. That's quite difficult to do online normally, so that's very good. Yeah, so I just want to start by saying thank you very much for the invitation, and what a great lineup of speakers it's been, and I'm really pleased to be part of this lineup, and particularly pleased to see Monica here on the lineup, who I've spoken with and written with previously, and I'm looking forward to hearing her talk after this one. So yeah, I want to talk today a little bit about how mapping data and open data and that relationship between open data and mapping has a great deal of advantages, and I think we spent most of the afternoon already talking about a lot of these advantages. We've seen a lot of applications of open data being used for mapping already, and lots of examples where it's being used for other things. But I think there's something quite unique about the way that open data is affected by the process of being mapped, and I think it's worth looking at some of the particularly unique things that might happen, and not entirely unique, but some of the more unique things that might happen when we actually start taking open data and putting it onto some sort of cartographic output. I'm probably edging towards a slightly more critical and perhaps a little bit more apprehensive edge of the things that we might be talking about this afternoon. I think it was very nice to hear Andrew talking about the Data Responsibility Journal. I think that's journey. That sounds like it's got a lot of overlaps with things like the Locus Charter and the UK's Office for National Statistics ethics framework that came out in June this year, that is looking at how we ethically use and map data, particularly, not exclusively open data, but that as well. So what I really want to talk about then is what happens once we've made data open and we started mapping it, and what we might learn about where that can have issues and how we might address some of those issues. So I want to start by imagining a forest. Those of you who are familiar with the Ordnance Survey maps of the UK will recognise these little trees as a forest. And we're imagining this forest here, and then as they do, along comes a nice logging company and says, I want to cut down this forest. And there's a lot of people who are reasonably unhappy about this, but in this particular scenario that I want us to imagine, there's an indigenous community who say, well, not only is this sort of deforestation a little bit of a concern to us, but actually this forest is a sacred forest to our community, and thus is protected by various international laws and legislations that mean it can't be deforested. Now, along comes a very well-meaning NGO in this, and this is not an entirely fictional story. Along comes a very well-meaning NGO who says, well, what would be very useful is it'd be really good if we can prove that this is a sacred forest. So they work very closely. They do some very good participatory work with the local community, and they come around And with the community, they map all of the trees that are designated as specifically sacred. Now, this NGO also is very keen on open data, and I'm very keen on open data. I may have made the same judgment about this, actually. So they're very keen on open data. I think, well, actually, do you know what's going to help this situation? Not only would it help if we've mapped all the sacred trees, but if everybody in the world knows that the sacred trees are there, then it means the whole world will become custodians of this forest, because anyone could object to this logging company because everybody knows that it's got the sacred trees in it and that it can't be logged. So they make the data open. But of course, the data is now open to the logging company as well. So the logging company come along, and logging company note which ones are the sacred trees, and they cut down everything else. The logging company are entirely within international law. The open data is entirely useful in the way that it was thought about being useful, and the forest is completely eradicated, bar the sacred trees, which actually really effectively removes the significance of the forest for the community around them. This isn't an entirely fictional story, and it's a slightly extreme example, but all the intentions in here were good intentions. And we do a lot of work in particularly putting humanitarian and development data into places like the humanitarian data exchange and into these kinds of places, because there is a great deal of benefit in making this data open and allowing lots of people to come at significant global challenges from a lot of perspectives that having the data open allows us to do. But there are significant challenges in ensuring that when we're making that data open in the humanitarian and development context particularly, but in other contexts too, that we're making some considerations about what might happen with this data and who actually really gets to own this data. So the next, about 20 minutes still, is going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour through some of the sort of ethical dilemmas of using open data, and a little bit about how we might overcome some of those, particularly when we're thinking about mapping data. So I don't think these things are things that we don't already know, at least in the back of our minds, sometimes in the front of our minds, sometimes tangentially, but they're things that are worth looking at square in the face when we're talking about this kind of thing. So classical ethical issues. Well, first classical ethical issue is that all perspectives are partial. It doesn't really matter how much open data we have, doesn't matter how many data sets that we bring together. We always have this issue of dark data. And I think it's much easier to get lured into thinking that we've avoided somehow dark data issues when we're talking about open data, and it feels like there's either a completely incomplete data set and we know that it's completely incomplete, or we start thinking, oh no, this is no, people are sharing properly now. We're starting to feel like we're getting a full data set. But of course, we'll never have a full data set. We often fall into this sort of duality between, have we got the data that we need for something, or are we using the data that we have for something? And this duality is something that Privacy International look at in relation to who we bother collecting data from and how we share that data. And the classic groups miss out. So children miss out in open data, and that might be for very good reasons, because we don't necessarily want to share lots of data about children, but that can adversely affect particular projects. Children growing up in poverty are even more likely to be missed from open data sets. People from communities whose knowledge can't easily be turned into Western style data. So for example, the Australian Aboriginals, with their concept of how you map the world, how you map time, can't really be turned into any data set that can fit into any of our open data repositories. So they become excluded. Increasingly, people without a mobile phone become excluded from our open data. We have to go looking quite hard to include these people into our data sets now. And of course, this leads to us only ever really being able to create partial perspectives of the world. If we wanted to recreate the world fully with our data, we'd need to have every piece of data about every single thing, which is an impossibility outside of fiction, like Borges' On the Exactitude of Science story, which could be probably the most quoted story of any geography conference ever, I would say. The other thing that we know is that platforms have politics. Yeah. So wherever we're putting this open data, whatever we're doing with this open data, however we're presenting it, whatever we're doing, the platform itself, the programming, the decision-making about how it's designed, all of this stuff that's often hidden from the users are deeply political, you know. And if you think we managed to avoid these things that are deeply political, you only have to look at who got invited to speak at the AI for Good Global Summit. Oh, it's the former CDO of Cambridge Analytica. This was after all the issues with Facebook. Yet still, here we are, AI for Good Global Summit. You know, there's a lot of politics going on here about the chief data officer being invited to talk about how to make the world a better place after Facebook being hauled over the coals for making the world a much worse place. But there's politics behind that decision. And this kind of politics leads us to data positivism as well, where, you know, if something's too complex, we might reduce it down to something that's our priority or our organization's priority, or we assume an authority that matches our own political ideology already. And that can then be at the expense of other people's knowledge and understandings of the world. We also know that no visualization is neutral, and we can see this in terms of things like, very specifically, data washing, where we know that people very purposefully can misrepresent data. And I mean, the pandemic has given me more case studies for my teaching than I'm ever going to be able to use in my entire career. But, you know, the classic sort of misrepresentation of data by skewing the axes on your graph. So this is how Argentina was reporting how many people had been tested for COVID-19. But if you sort of actually graphed it properly, it would look like this, and we'd see Argentina had barely scratched the surface. But of course, when it was on television, they were looking like things were quite good. That's a very obvious thing, but it becomes much more difficult to discern this kind of data washing or biased visualizations when we look at maps. So this is Google Maps, the same part of the United States in April 2010 and in April 2016. And all Google's done here in their mind and what they in their documentation about Google Maps is to make roads more prominent and to make the map less cluttered by removing some of the place names. Now, this might be a reasonably innocuous thing to do, that there's no real harm by this, but actually there's knock-on effects. The map on the right, the 2016 one, starts to suggest that things are further away from each other. There's been studies into this, that when there's less town names, people assume they're going to need to drive places. That because the prominence of roads has been increased rather than the prominence of, say, footpaths or other ways of moving around, or bus routes or train lines, it actually moves people more towards driving their cars. So a simple choice about how to visualize our map that, yes, much less cluttered, actually pushes people towards driving. Well, we know that driving is one of those things that's contributing to climate change. So maybe that's actually quite a significant issue if our way of mapping the world encourages people to drive rather than take public transport. Another example, and this is from a trip that I did when I was working in West Bank doing some research. Flew in via Tel Aviv, and myself and some colleagues were looking for somewhere to eat. And we thought, oh, this would be interesting. I wonder what happens if you search for restaurants in different languages. And indeed, depending on whether you search in Arabic or Hebrew, you get sent to different parts of the city. Now, that might make absolutely perfect sense. Perhaps if you do speak Arabic, you do want to go to a restaurant that sells more Arabic food. And if you speak Hebrew, you may want to go to restaurants that are more to your taste as well. But we know that this part of the world has significant issues around the way it's ghettoized, the way that it's been divided up, the way that populations interact. And the simple act of searching for where to have dinner is in some ways reinforcing this because of the way that the data is available in both languages, but the way it's been inputted and the way it's been used. This is via OpenStreetMap, so perfectly open data, but the way it's been categorized by different languages means that we're essentially dividing the city into the more Arabic speaking restaurants being in Jaffa, which is perhaps what we might expect historically, but they're not being that sort of mixing of populations, the map reinforcing those divisions that are already there. Yeah, and this is what led to this idea that Sartre put forward, that maps really are an ideology of lies. Yeah, that if we did this right, we can just use maps for pillage. Yeah, and we can use them as an alibi for aggression because we can claim that the map already shows that this looks like this. There's also, and I think this for me is the most significant issue around open data, because as open as data is, ownership remains entirely uneven on this, and this is hugely problematic. Yeah, I use this particular image when I'm teaching students at the university about data and extracting data. Data in its incredibly raw form is borderline worthless. Yeah, panning for gold. The gold that is dug up in this picture's from Democratic Republic of Congo is essentially worthless in its purest form. It doesn't become worth something until it's been aggregated, till it's been purified, till it's been brought together into gold bullion bars, and that's done somewhere normally quite far away from the source of that gold. And the same is very much true of data. Now, open data gets us around some of these issues, but not all of them. So, for example, when Google was talking about bringing broadband to lots of places, they suggested that, this was from Uganda, that they should, that all Ugandans should put as much of their health information online as possible, because this will become beneficial to the online community and the world. But what Google actually really meant was that it will become beneficial for Google to be able to organize and redistribute this data. Now, we know Google don't work in open data, so this is not an open data example, but it is an example of where we see organizations saying, well, don't worry, we'll sort that data out for you, and then we'll redistribute it. And that's got problems. There's no legislation in just over 60% of the countries around the protection of health data. So while we might be collecting open health data for very good reasons, that data is not then protected when it's made public and open. In the UK, we're very lucky, our health data is very tied down. Other places it is less so. You've got companies like Fitbit and all of these sort of smartwatches and things that are desperate to open our data, but probably not in a way that most of us would want. And even if we just look at where data travels to, once we start storing our open data, we store it in data centers once it's big enough, and it starts being stored in the US, in the UK, in Germany. If we look at the physical location of data centers around the world, we can see that there's a very north-south, to use those quite problematic terms, but a north-south divide. These are Google's data centers, Microsoft's data centers, not much different. So there's a real disparity in how this data is being stored. And we know that sending packets of data from the global south to the north is considerably cheaper than receiving those packages of data back. We also know that it's many organizations in the global north who have the processing power to deal with these huge data sets. But then how accessible are those data sets? How accessible is open data when we're sharing it back to those communities that it may have been extracted from? And I use the word extracted quite specifically, as it ties to that analogy with panning for gold. And it's not just a global south, global north thing. It was actually on the BBC this morning. I slipped this slide in about 30 seconds before we were speaking. Footballers in the UK are currently incredibly annoyed because all of their performance statistics have been made open data and are used for people to gamble on how well people are going to perform, and to do trading on football statistics and on trading on performances and things. And owners of this data, essentially the person whose legs it is are running around the pitch and doing the scoring, have said, well, if you're making this much money out of the data about how well I play football, why aren't I making any money out of the data? You know, and this brings us back to, you know, we could go sort of into the theoretical ideas of the Frankfurt School and people here, where we're talking about that alienation from the production of things, and we're massively alienating people from the production of their own data by taking their data and using it for something else. In this particular case, and I'd like to see the interview with someone from Leyton Orient who says, as the Frankfurt School said, you've alienated me from my football playing data here, and I would like to regain my means of production. But, you know, it's a serious point that actually this is happening in lots of different little ways where we become alienated from our own data through the openness of the data. And that's got its own quirks and issues that I don't have an answer for, but I think we need to be very aware of. So what does this all mean? It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour through there. So how do we move forwards from this? And I don't really have full answers of how we move forwards from this. I actually think, not to preempt Monica's talk, apologies, Monica, if you're listening, but I'm sure Monica has some answers to this sort of thing. She normally does. But how do we move forwards? Well, one of the things that in geography that was seen as being the fix-all of everything was the idea of what in about 2008 sort of got termed, the term had existed for longer, but became quite popular, the term neo-geography or participatory geographic information systems. But this idea that with open data, people can make their own maps. Yeah, they can consider what they think is important. They can make maps of what they're going to fight for. And I think this is a really important thing that we think about with open data, whether it's mapping or otherwise, that if we put the data out there in sufficient amounts, and we equip people with the knowledge to use that data, or we make the data accessible enough, then people will be able to express their critical desires around the world using that data, and those desires may well then be addressed. And I love that idea. I wish it was as simple as that. But I think the last 12 years of talking about neo-geography, it's become very clear that actually we're not able to break those bounds of what mapping actually is. And mapping is in itself both a incredibly biased activity. It's one that's incredibly mixed up in its history of power relations between the mapper and the mapped. And all the way through, we know that actually none of these issues have got anything to do with the data per se, that actually the biases that are here are more of a social problem, and that no amount of data in and of itself is actually going to fix the biases within the society that we're talking about. So I do think we should be making our data as open as possible, but I do think we should be considering the biases within that data of those types that I've talked about, and where that openness might be problematic. And just to sort of round us off with a couple more slides, I think we should be very aware that trying to fill in the blanks in our data sets can do much more harm than good. For example, if we take a facial recognition system, this is a good example, which are famously bad at working on people of color, famously bad at working on women of color, because they're often trained on white men. Yeah. So what do we do if we want to improve our facial recognition system? What we have to do is we have to find a lot of women of color, and we have to catalog them and categorize them and put them into our data sets. This turns us into some sort of vast instrument of surveillance and classification, with the underlying idea that we're doing something good, but actually we're doing something where we're really rendering humans to be more machine readable in this particular case. So what are we doing when we try to fill in the blanks of our data sets? Are we alleviating our concerns? Are we representing a population, or are we actually not really equalizing representation, but increasing the alienation and classification of other people? I think it's probably worth, coming back to this quote, which, sits in my mind almost constantly every time I open up my computer. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. If we are using the same tools of data usage that we've always used, doesn't matter how open our data is, we're just using the same tools. We're just pretending that our data is better now, And I think also this quote from Chambers, talking about international development stuff, we have to consider who are we talking about? Who counts in all of this? Who gets to make the decision about what data is worthwhile having in our open data sets and what gets left out? Who cleans what and who's there? So 4 slides very quickly to finish off. Got 1 minute. Here's my 4 things that I think we can do. I've just realized there's 5 slides, but it'll still only take 1 minute. Here's my 4 things that we can do or think about, have in our minds as we're working with open data, as we're mapping open data quite specifically, that might address some of this. 1, knowledge can't be provincialized nor passed off as universal. None of our data sets are universal, but none of them either should be provincialized and seen as being something that's uniquely specialist or uniquely other from other data. Yeah. So where does that data fit between provincialization and universalization? When we're talking about mapping, particularly, we talk about the concept of the gaze. We haven't really got time to go into that, but when we're meaning that doesn't matter how we move our data around, we have to be very careful that we're not just transferring an old conflict onto a new way of looking at the same data. So how do we ensure that we're actually readdressing that conflict rather than just transferring it? We've got to avoid that illusion of completeness that comes with using multiple data sets. It's very tempting to fall into thinking that we have complete data. It's the dream. We want to have that complete data. It will never happen. It will never happen. Anyone who tells me they've got a complete data set, I run a mile. I'm not interested. If they can't tell me at least one person who's missing, I'm scared. Right? In terms of maps, penultimate slide. Look, maps and visualizations. This is a great quote from Harley, 2002, in the New Nature of Maps. A really interesting text. Maps and visualizations can be more destructive than guns and warships in their power to oppress the other and to cross insurrection against anything but the map's own representation of power. Very specifically talking about maps here. But when we're talking about the other, we're talking about communities that are often those that we're collecting data from, but often those who don't have access to the tools and the data themselves, no matter how open it is, to tell their own story. So we may not be intentionally trying to crush anybody, but we are representing a certain sort of power. So our last slide then, last quote. This is the question. When we're using open data, when we're mapping open data, however we're visualizing it, but particularly when we're mapping it, is it what we're finding in the world, or is it what we are making up from the data that we have to meet those other ideological, internalized ideas that we might have about our own and other people's existence? That was 26 minutes. I apologize, but I will finish there.
Thank you so much, Doug, for this very human-centered and ethical perspective that we haven't had so far. Very, very interesting. Are there questions in the chat here? We have one from Oleg. What is a good place, no pun intended, to look for and share deprovincialized, deregionalized, denationalized data sets where completeness, or rather the explicit lack thereof, is in focus?
That's a very good question. And I think you should be allowed to put puns in your questions. I think that makes them much better, actually. So, I mean, where is a good place? I mean, there's so many data sets. I on my own personal website, not to sort of flag up my own works, but I try and keep a bit of a running list of databases that I use with my students. And some of them are purposely bad, so that the students go in and look at data and they come out and they produce something that they are shocked by how awful it is. And other ones are very good. I do think that the humanitarian data exchange has a lot of very good stuff on it. It's slightly it's a bit technologically deterministic in its viewpoint of the world, so it does have that sense that if they get everything onto one repository, it will solve all humanitarian crises. But I think there is an awful lot of incredibly good data there, that some of which is very regionalized, some of it which isn't, some of which you can mash together to make less provincialized data, and others which needs to be looked at with a really big spoon of skepticism. But it's a good place to start looking, I think. And you know, there is a lot of government open data. It's slow to be produced, but it's often because governments are actually looking at these little gaps that I'm highlighting. And as much as I might not like to think of our governments as doing something very useful with data, but actually that slowness is because they are often trying to avoid some of the issues, such as the logging one that I started with. So government open data can be a very rich source purely because it's gone through a lot of processes, but it is also coming from one of the most political sources that we could imagine. So it does have that. So yeah, there's a lot of open data out there. A lot of universities hold open data repositories now, which again, more problematic sometimes less problematic. A lot of academic publishing now requires people to publish their data open in order to publish their journal articles. So there's increasingly large amounts held through university repositories, often with an article that goes with it that may explain its limitations, which is probably a good place to start. But yeah, there's no straight answer as to a good place. There's lots of places that are partially good.
Thank you. On to the next one. Open data is just a tool. Tools are never good or bad. So would the answer to this be increased data literacy so we are better able to use this tool in a responsible way?
Well, is that a question from Heidegger there, by the sounds of things? Every tool is neutral. You should come to my lecture where I pull a knife on the students and ask them whether I should be using it for cooking or for getting up to no good. It's always starts off the beginning of the semester quite nicely. I don't think, yeah, tools aren't neutral. I don't think. I think every one of the tools that we've talked about are inherently political. There's politics baked into a lot of these tools. I think we can push them towards being better or worse, or being used for more good or for more unpleasant purposes. But I don't think there's a full neutrality within those tools itself. The question around data literacy and media literacy and these kinds of things, I think is really interesting, because there's two schools of thought on this. One, and I do sort of agree with your point that actually, well, if we educate people about this, then we don't need to worry quite so much. People will, you know, question things themselves. But it does feel always a little bit like we're putting the onus on the wrong people. If we're encouraging the entire population, I do think we should encourage data literacy. I don't think that's a bad thing. But if we go so far, we can end up saying, well, actually, don't look. Doesn't matter if we get it a bit wrong. It's for everybody else to judge us. Yeah. And let me use an example from media studies stuff, where we talk about, do we need to increase media literacy, or do we need to hold newspapers to account, for example? And there's a lot of argument for saying, well, let's improve media literacy because then the population will hold the newspaper to account. Or we could regulate a newspaper so it can't put lies on its front page. And that's the two schools of thought. And so, well, okay, I could teach the entire population to say, I don't trust the newspaper, or that I should question every newspaper, or I should reject particular types of newspaper. But A, I'll never reach every bit of the population, and B, it becomes not actually a way to change what's happening, because you build up sort of skepticism and resentment to the point potentially of being unhelpful. So there's a balance about where we put the emphasis. I don't think we should be teaching kids that Facebook is problematic and that they should be careful of their privacy. I think we should be holding Facebook to account and saying that you should be private by default. They changed their policy in 2009, I think it was, and everything was open by default, whereas previously it had been private by default. Well, they could put it back, and then we wouldn't need so much data literacy and privacy literacy and media literacy in order for people to be naturally protected. Yeah. It's things like iPhones. Almost everything on an iPhone is automatically encrypted. Almost nothing on an Android phone is encrypted. If you've got lower data literacy, go for an iPhone. You don't have to worry about it. If you're worried about stuff, you have to work quite hard with an iPhone, with an Android phone. Maybe that's fine if that's your choice, but the Android phone is cheaper. So you're going to go for an Android phone perhaps because of the price, and you're left more vulnerable. Is that fair? So I don't think we can put all the onus on the general population to have to increase their data literacy in order to not be exploited. I do think that increasing data literacy, though, as a general thing, can be no bad thing. So yes, increase data literacy, but that's not the answer to everything. Would be my slightly overly long comment on that.
Thank you very much. Another one, was everything better in analog times? Example given with hand-drawn single edition maps in the Middle Ages.
That's a good question. I realized I was holding a pen all the way through that. So maybe that's a subconscious desire for the analog. No, look, I don't think so. I mean, there's a risk here, isn't there, of retreating away from advancing things, of being some sort of Luddite and smashing all the technology and saying, well, no, let's not have any of this. But hand-drawn single edition maps in the Middle Ages had way more power over populations than perhaps our maps do now. They were hand-drawn and single use for one single purpose generally, and that was for the annexation of populations and the collection of taxes. So they were certainly tools of power, tools of imperialism, tools of colonialism, and tools of oppression. Maps now do give us a little bit more option, but they're still built on the same cartographic ideals that those maps from the Middle Ages were built on, which means that that inherent relationship between the mapper and the mapped is still there. But we might have more option of creating those counter maps, of bastardizing those maps, of moving those maps around and reshaping them, of editing things. But we have to be deeply aware that that cartographic ideal is still quite deeply baked in. So I don't think a return to analog is the answer. Perhaps on an individual basis it is, because it's much easier to remove yourself from everything in an analog world. But on a societal level, we're moving in the right direction. I don't think we're moving in the wrong direction. I think things are getting better. We're doing all of these. Everyone here is doing this because they want to make at least an incremental improvement to people's lives. And that's what, and people are doing that. The question is, are we skipping something as we're going along? Have we sort of forgotten something? Are we rushing too fast? Should we just take stock and say, oh, have I missed something? But yeah, it's going in the right direction as a general rule.
One last question. Do you have ideas for regulatory measures on geographical open data? That's
a good question. So there's been a couple of things that have come out this year, which have been quite interesting. So there was a Locus Charter that was put out by the Benchmark Initiative in the UK, which is a sort of, it's not quite an NGO, how do they describe themselves? A not-for-profit sort of organisation. And they put out this charter of ethical guidelines on using geographical data and also it's open data as well. And as I said earlier, the Office for National Statistics put out their guidelines for the use of geospatial data and again covers open data. That was May, I think, this year. I can put some links into the chat one in a moment for you if that's helpful. But they go so far, but they don't address everything. They have to be kept quite broad because of the nature of wanting to cover everything. I think, you know, they do quite a good job in lots of respects. But when we start to look at absolute behemoths like Facebook, and you know, Facebook gobbles up more of OpenStreetMap's data than any other platform in the world, right? And Facebook make an awful lot of money out of that. And we're talking about people giving up their free labor for making OpenStreetMap, and then Facebook are taking it. Now, none of the regulatory and ethical frameworks that I've seen have anything in them that talk about that connection between people's data and people's time in the OpenStreetMap world being then co-opted by a multinational for profit. Now, there's a big divide, I believe, in the OpenStreetMap community about whether that's okay or that's not okay, and that's another debate, another probably an entire conference on that. So there's some good stuff around ethical use of data and ethical presentation of data and ethical storage of data and even ethical collection of data. Some of it I don't think goes far enough. But there isn't very much around the ethical relationship to those who produce the data and the value of that data and who gains the value from that data. And I think that's very hard to put in, but it's something that I think is probably our next stage to really need to address as a geospatial community, but probably as a wider open data community as well.